SECfans.com. It's championship week, and based on our discussion last week for Michigan Ohio State, we thought it was going to be Michigan here. It is Ohio State. We're going to talk about how the model got it wrong, how we got it wrong, and where does that put Ohio State based on how we view them, how we think they're going to handle this Northwestern team or not. We'll talk about it. I want to remind everybody, please subscribe. We are very objective SEC fans. I think Ohio State, Notre Dame, Michigan fans this year have been our biggest subscriber base growth because they get past that SEC name and they're willing to listen to us and generally tell us that we're objective. If you are still hesitant, just hang with us at the end of the video. You're going to agree that we're objective and you're going to want to subscribe. So go ahead and do it now. All right, Josh, Ohio State, Michigan was a game that we talked about last week for about half an hour. We've been pretty good on both of these teams this year, picking them the right way, but we missed this game. We missed it, but I will say, and first of all, people are like, burn your model's terrible. Look, our model was right in line with Vegas, and no Ohio State fan was putting money down picking Ohio State to win that game by 30 points. Nobody. If you read on the board, the discussions we had on the podcast, on the Rivals Ohio State podcast, the discussion was, we'd like to see this and this and this to give us a chance to win the game. So it's a little weird to come back and crow and say, oh, yeah, burn your model. So I'm a little touchy on that. And I will say, by the way, the 7 overtime game, Texas A&M and LSU, our model actually predicted a tie in that game. So our model was right 6 times in one game. Anyway, a couple of things we did flag in that game going into it, in our discussions on the forums, in the video, everywhere. One of the things we flagged was we didn't think Michigan, as much as we weren't high on Ohio State's defense, we did not think Michigan had the type of offense that could really exploit this Ohio State defense. The other thing that we flagged was last year. So Michigan had a very highly ranked defense, but we said coming into this season, one of our concerns was Michigan, when they faced the top 50 offense last year, gave up 32 points per game. And we talked about how coming into this game, they really hadn't faced a top 50 offense. They faced Notre Dame with Wimbush, without Dexter Williams, and then they faced Western Michigan that's not really a top 50 offense. And both of those things really not only showed up, they showed up a lot bigger and a lot more pronounced than we thought they would. So we can get into that a little more if you want to, or we can talk specifically about this matchup. One of the things I'd like to know is, and no disrespect to Northwestern, but they have had some bumps along the way with Duke and Akron and whatever. Is Northwestern just more of the same for Michigan? And then if that's true, what do they do against Ohio State? Because those matchup disadvantages are still there.
So a number of different questions to unpack there, right? I think the first thing is to sort of address the elephant in the room with Ohio State, Michigan. Obviously, our model got it wrong. To your point, one, if our model gets a game wrong, I'm never going to be too upset if it's getting more games right than wrong. If our model was able to get every game right, we would be currently living in a golden palace in Las Vegas. And as it is, we're still, generally, I think both of us are picking now over 65% against the spread, the two of us. The model has actually been about 500 this year. But even that's doing fine. It means it's setting a fair baseline. I feel like we've been more or less accurate. It's just sometimes you're going to have misses. In that game, so I've brought this statistic up a million times this season, and usually in Michigan videos, and it's become a broken record, so I didn't bring it up too much before the Ohio State-Michigan game, though I did some. But what is my favorite statistic last year about Michigan against top 50 offenses?
Give up 32 points a game.
Right. Dan Brown's defense, has consistently been torched by upper-level offenses. Consistently. And this year, usually I'm really stubborn. As if you follow this channel and hear the predictions I make, and I kind of sometimes come across as a grim reaper, the reason I'm really stubborn is trends like that in football, where the trend is this team has a problem with X. If you have a real trend, it's way too easy to jump off the bandwagon and think it's fixed or that a team has become good or solved some problem off one game. And in Michigan's case, I'm kicking myself because I knew deep down Michigan has a schematic problem or a personnel problem or probably both with high-powered offenses and dealing with them.
Just to sort of piggyback on that, I'm going to let you run with it because we both noticed this during the game when we were texting each other. There's nothing in that game epitomizes that point that you just made more than having Devin Bush on the fastest player on the field.
Right. So there was a point in that game where Paris Campbell catches a short pass, just kind of crossing the field and then turns up and runs for a touchdown. It was like a 70-yard touchdown pass. They had Devin Bush in man coverage with Paris Campbell. And you know what that game reminded me of was 2012 Notre Dame playing in Alabama in the national title. And it reminded me of it because that Notre Dame team in 2012 was like a top 5 defense. But we had, this was way back when, before we were doing this YouTube channel, I was doing some blog stuff and I had flagged that game and said, I thought that game was going to be a blowout. And the reason was not that I was an SEC homer. It was that Notre Dame had never had to leave their base defense at any point that season. No one they had played had forced them into nickel or dime sets. And they were just used to playing standard coverage, it can be extremely effective when you have better athletes than the other team because you don't have any busts. You play the guy in front of you and you kind of keep everything in front. You shut them down. But when they played a team, Alabama came in and had Amari Cooper and they had no one on the field that could cover him one-on-one. And they're trying to do man coverage and it just did not work. Michigan had the same problem. They got in that game. They didn't really have a proper way to react to nickel they didn't even have, in my view, a proper dime set. They have Devin Bush covering a slot receiver because they don't want to put more defensive backs in the field and change their alignment. When they do that Devin Bush is a phenomenal middle linebacker. Just like in the NFL, an NFL middle linebacker cannot cover an NFL caliber talent at slot receiver.
No.
He will be torched. And I don't know why Michigan has such horrible game planning
it was crazy to me because they switched to zone midstream, and part of this was observed in the game. I think Michigan's man corners, LSU is very analogous to LSU. Greedy Williams, Delpit at safety. They were allowed to get away this year with being very physical and sometimes being very handsy that would impact the pass game. And when that started getting called early and those crossers were just eating them alive, they tried to switch to zone midstream and they just couldn't do it. That's something to me. You can't switch if your bread and butter all day long is man defense. You can't switch to zone against an elite offense in the middle of the game and have any kind of success.
No, it was baffling. And I don't want to take away from what Ohio State did, because the point here is Ohio State made this happen because they were athletically on a different level than anyone Michigan had played. And they exposed something in Michigan that just had been hidden the entire season. We made a very similar point when we were making our Alabama-Georgia prediction that one of our question marks for this game is Alabama has not really played a rushing attack remotely as good as Georgia. And Alabama at times has been run on this year. If there's a way Georgia is going to win that game, I think both of us are of the opinion Georgia's going to win that game because they can run the ball. And that's going to be the shocking thing for Alabama. And Alabama's going to have to compensate in ways they weren't prepared to. And you can see that snowballing. That's what happened in the Ohio State-Michigan game. That's why we missed. That's why everybody missed. Michigan saw something that Michigan had not seen this before. We hadn't seen Michigan face this before. We got a little bit of a snippet with it with Indiana running crossers. I'm sure Ohio State picked up on that. And then they exposed this basically latent defect in Michigan where, in retrospect, I think if Michigan was to play Oklahoma, if Michigan was to play Alabama, if Michigan was to play Clemson or any other team with a high-powered offense, they'd be giving up 60 points. I don't think their defensive scheme can compensate for it. And that's basically what we saw with Ohio State. That I will say the other thing we did get right in our preview was noting that the Purdue game, very quietly, Ohio State only scored 20 points, and they struggled in the red zone, and they weren't very effective. And then, in much as the Maryland game was a close, quote, bad game, it showed the way that Ohio State was able to operate consistently to score 50 to 60 points in a ball game. And that sort of consistent offensive thing, the fact that they were clicking, allowed them to take advantage of all those sorts of issues. So that's the big answer to Ohio State, Michigan, and I've already forgotten what the second half of your question was.
Okay, so the original question was, and I hate we had to go through such a protracted sort of explanation, but I think there's a lot of football talk there, and a lot of it is still relevant to this game. So the question was, is Northwestern kind of Michigan light? And if that's the case, are we looking at more of the same, especially since we've seen Northwestern struggles more than Michigan running the ball in general? Maybe a little bit better with the passing attack at times. Are we looking at more of the same, and is that where the whole thing just ends? That if Ohio State can do this to Michigan and Northwestern is kind of Michigan light, that's what we're going to see?
I think there's probably a pretty solid argument for it. And if you go back and look at Northwestern's schedule and pass defense, Northwestern has not, week in and week out, been very good. And in particular, Notre Dame had over 10 yards per attempt against Northwestern. And even though that was a close game, 31-21, Notre Dame was 22 of 34 passing, 343 yards. It's one of the games that established Ian Book as this sort of phenom quarterback. Earlier in the season, Akron, why did they lose to Akron? Because they gave up 10 yards per attempt, 277 yards passing in 28 attempts. Northwestern has been very up and down, but what this shows, to your point, there's a little bit of the same concern here that when Northwestern has played better offenses, and that mark, I'm going to be frank, and the Big Ten is, I'm not going to say whether they're good or bad overall, but I will say they're top heavy, which I think everybody would admit. Michigan and Ohio State in particular are on a different level than the rest of the conference. And that's been pretty clear throughout the season, I think. Offensively, or defensively, Northwestern, they're only averaging 6.8 yards per attempt. And that sounds great. But one of the things we look at is, opponent averages in our model. Their opponents only average 6.87 yards per attempt, which is, nationally, that's a pretty miserable mark. So, when you consider that the average Northwestern team is 95th in passing, average, that's the average team that they faced, it kind of draws you back a little bit from taking too much about how good Northwestern's pass defense is. And so that makes me sort of draw back and sort of go, okay, maybe I need to look in this further. So first, all right, if you've played 12 teams and your average opponent is essentially 95th in passing defense or passing offense, all right, well, now I need to look at the numbers and see, well, how did you do when you played the better ones? The better ones in this case really are, Michigan. Well, you gave up, Michigan's not great, but you gave up 8.2 yards per attempt. Duke is a pretty good passing offense. They lost that game, gave up 8.5, gave up 10 to Akron. Now, those games were all early in the year, and it's easy to say, well, that was just because it was early in the year and things have changed. But why did it change? Well, you played Michigan State. You played Nebraska before they got healthy in the passing game. You played Rutgers. You played Wisconsin. They can't throw the ball. And then when you played Notre Dame, all of a sudden you give up 10 yards per attempt again. So all of that, to me, frankly, makes me look at this and go, I don't think Northwestern's really improved so much as they are a very traditional grinding defense that plays hard-nosed football. But when they get spread out by a team that's able to spread them out and really throw the ball vertically, then they get out-athleted and they get exposed a little bit. Ohio State is a much better passing offense than any of the teams I just named. To me, that's really the defining factor in that game. I think the model, when I look at it, suggests it's a defining factor. But as we'll get to in a minute, is one, the model does have Ohio State winning this game, but I'm personally not even sure that it really accounts for the full extent that Ohio State's passing offense, the way it's taking off, is going to be able to win the game. So it could potentially be an even bigger gap than we're seeing right now.
All right, so since we're there, why don't we go ahead and get into the numbers? Show us the model that Ohio State fans have been killing us for the last 24 hours and let us know what the model says, and we'll go from there.
Right. So first thing we do is generate intermediate neutral statistics. And you may think our model needs to be thrown in the trash, is what we've heard a lot. But this neutral statistic is a straight neutral stat, and it's percentage of opponent averages allowed. So if your opponent's average 5 yards per carry and you allow 4, you allow 75 or 80% of their average, straight neutral number. In this case, Ohio State is allowing 101% of opponent rushing averages and 104% of opponent passing averages. They had what seems like a good day against Michigan. I'll give the caveat that, Ohio State may have won that game handily, but they did give up 39 points to Michigan. That was not in and of itself, a great day really defensively. It seemed that way because Michigan gave up 62 points, but beyond that, Michigan was more or less able to score. If you knew Michigan was going to score 39 points in that game going in, you probably would have assumed they were going to win. So I think Ohio State did well for the most part, and they got some easy points I get in that game. But I still think this number is not really surprising that Ohio State's given up 101% of rush averages, 104% against the pass. Northwestern is a little bit better defensively, but maybe not as good as some people would think. Northwestern's giving up 90% of opponent rushing averages and 99% of opponent passing averages. So again, we say 95% against the run is average, and run or pass, and you want to get the number below that because everybody's stats are a little boosted by playing group of 5 teams. What that means is Northwestern's rush defense is just above average, and their pass defense is probably below average statistically. You can vary out whether or not you want to make it that number, but I'm just telling you as a plain neutral, non-adjusted, this isn't Josh speaking stat. These teams give up your average day in the passing game, and give up your average day more or less in the run game, Northwestern being a little better against the run. Now, when you apply those numbers to each team's offensive production historically, the model is predicting that Ohio State's going to run for 4 yards per carry and throw for 9 yards per attempt. That's a pretty darn good offensive day. Northwestern's predicted to run for 3 yards per carry and throw for 6.5 yards per attempt. The reason for that differential is more to do with the Northwestern offense just not being very good historically this season, than it is statistically with Ohio State. In other words, Ohio State can have a pretty average day or a poor day defensively, and Northwestern's still not going to score a ton. And that's probably exacerbated by the fact that like we talked about in the Michigan game, Michigan's offense is more straightforward and doesn't do things like Maryland, where Maryland can exploit a poor defense because of all their motions, the way Matt Canada's offense works. Our model picks up on that kind of thing. And here it's also suggesting that Northwestern's offense isn't going to scale up. So 6.6 yards per play for Ohio State, under 5 yards per play for Northwestern. That's going just anytime you're allowing a team to have almost 7 yards per play, they're going to score a lot of points. So unsurprisingly, Ohio State 38, Northwestern 22.
And I think part of the issue with the model, and we talked about this in another show where we were discussing where the model might have some blind spots. Part of the issue is the model seems to get really good teams pretty well, and it's been all over Alabama this year. Last year, I think it was 4 points off the Michigan Ohio State score. I think it predicted like 31-27, and it ended up, or 31-17, and it ended up being 31-20 or 21, something like that. The issue is I feel like the model overvalues mediocre teams a little bit, and all of college football, save a handful of teams, is pretty mediocre this year. Like we've talked about how there's not a big difference between 7-17 or 7-25. And it's throwing the model off a little bit. But also, if you think for a moment that Notre Dame and Michigan, if Michigan was fool's gold, therefore Notre Dame probably is a little bit too, it vastly overvalues some things where it probably shouldn't. And I think a little bit of that is happening here. I do think if you're Northwestern against what I think is a poor defense in Ohio State, Northwestern should score 22 points, 23 points. The problem is scheme-wise, I don't think they have, like we talked about last week, I think they're a lot like Michigan, and they're not going to have the things that can exploit Ohio State. They're not going to have the RPOs, the shifts, and the things that will really exploit the linebacker and safety issues. So I think 22 is is probably about right. But I'm going to go 17 for Northwestern. And I'm going to go higher for Ohio State. I do think it's a little bit of a potential for it to be kind of a sleepwalk game after what they just had. But I also think the fact that they're in the playoff hunt now, in the playoff discussion, we're going to see them try to put a number like they did against Wisconsin a few years ago to play their way in. I'm going to go 45-17, which is interesting because it gives Ohio State 2 data points common opponents versus that Notre Dame has. And I'm going to make an argument in a minute as to why not only do I think Ohio State should be in the playoffs, I think they should be at the 3 spot. But 45-17 is what I'm going with. Tell me what you think.
So I'm not too different from you from that based off that long discussion. I do think that it's really undervaluing how Ohio State may perform in this situation. We've seen this from every statistical model this year. Every model seems to be overvaluing, I would say, team. I don't want to say mediocre because it's probably a poor word. There's 130 teams in college football, and teams really numbers 30 through 90 are average, if you want to spread it out that way. And those average teams seem to be overvalued, both in terms of what it means to beat those teams and how good they are and how well they hold up. And I think it's really due to how top-heavy a lot of the conferences are, but that's a different discussion. I don't think it's unrealistic to think that Northwestern scores in the low 20s. They've been able to do that pretty consistently this year. I think Ohio State's going to score more than predicted. So I have Ohio State with 49 points, and I'm going to say Northwestern 24, 49-24. And a part of that I will say is if Ohio State scores that much, it means they're going to give more drives to Northwestern and give them the opportunity to score more over the course of the game. I think if Ohio State wasn't able to produce that many points, the game would be shorter and the Northwestern score would probably be lower.
All right, y'all. That's it. That's all I've got on this one. We ran a little long again as usual, but that's what we do. We're kind of known for it by now at this point. I want to remind everybody, please subscribe if you haven't already. We're probably going to do some live shows later in that gap between the this weekend finishing up and the actual bowl games and playoff games. So you'll want that notification to know when you can get in and talk some trash with some SEC fans. Comment in the discussion. Let us know down there. Write your comment out and let us know what you think the score is going to be. You can tell us how bad our model was last week. You can tell us Northwestern fans how crazy we are. We just like to have the discussion either way. We'll find you on Rivals, like we always say. 11 Warriors. We didn't get posted there last week. We'd love to get posted there if possible. If not, oh well. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.